These are the lecture notes for Chapter 6 on the skeletal system. This is a very long chapter, so just warning you ahead of time. I will try to make sure that you know the topics that I'm going to focus on for the exam, for the midterm exam, so that you can make sure that when you're studying that you can narrow down and focus your studying a little bit better. So I'm going to skip through the learning outcomes to save a little bit of time. Make sure that you know that the components of the skeletal system are the bones, but also, and we will focus on the bones, but also the cartilages, the joints, ligaments, and connective tissue that stabilize or connect bones, such as tendons. We will focus on bones, and then this chapter also includes joints and joint movement. So that's what makes this chapter so long, is that you're learning about bones, bone tissue. You are learning the names of the bones, and then you're also learning about joints and the movements at joints. So that just makes it a really long long chapter, but I'm going to try to make it narrow it down a little bit for you. So the functions of the skeletal system, there are 5, I think, total. Yeah, 5 functions, and that would be support. Bones provide structural support. They also provide attachment sites for muscles and sometimes organs and other soft tissues. Make sure that you know that there are 2 minerals that are stored within bone tissue, calcium, of course, and lipids or fats are stored within yellow bone marrow, which is what you find within the marrow cavity of long bones. And then you have blood cell production. All the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are produced in the red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow is found not within the marrow cavity, but it's found within spongy bone. So the bone that has a lot of spaces between the bone tissue. You find that at the ends of your long bones and other areas, like, for example, your skull bones have a lot of spongy bone. Spongy bone is lighter weight, so it helps reduce the weight of the skeleton. But the red bone marrow produces the blood cells, and the yellow bone marrow stores fat. Okay. Then we have protection. For example, the skull protects the brain, and the ribs protect the heart and the lungs. And then bones function as levers. The muscles contract and push and pull against bones, and that's what causes movement. Moving on, we're going to talk about bone tissue, which is also called osseous tissue. Remember that bone is a supporting connective tissue. So it consists of bone cells, which always start with the prefix osteo, because osteo means bone. So we have osteocytes, osteoblast, osteoclast, are different names of bone cells. And then the matrix of bone consists of the ground tissue is formed from calcium phosphate, which provides the strength to bone tissue and accounts for almost 2/3 of the weight of bone. Make sure you know that. And then the extracellular protein fibers are collagen primarily, and the collagen fibers provide some flexibility. Even though we know that collagen fibers are the strongest of the protein fibers found in connective tissue, in bone they account for the flexibility of bone, and they provide about 1/3, or they account for about 1/3 of the weight of bone. So 2/3 is calcium phosphate, 1/3 is collagen fibers. We classify the different bones of the skeleton by their shape primarily. So the long bones are going to be the bones that are found in your upper and lower limbs. The example given here is the humerus, which is your arm bone, your upper arm bone, which, as you know, in anatomy, when we say arm, we mean the upper arm. So the humerus is the bone that's found there. And also the radius and ulna would be long bones. The radius is the bone that's found alongside of the thumb, and the ulna is found on the medial side on your pinky side. Short bones, the best examples are the carpals and the tarsals. Carpals are your wrist bones and the tarsals are your ankle bones. Flat bones are going to be like your skull bones, for example, are flat bones. And here is the one of your skull bones called the parietal bone. There are actually two parietal bones. And then irregular bones like the vertebrae. So they're going to have an irregular shape. All right, so we're not going to learn all of the different types of bone, but we will talk about the structural features of long bones. The shaft of a long bone is called the diaphysis. The diaphysis is where you can find the marrow cavity, which we said, remember, stores lipids. That's where you find yellow bone marrow. Sometimes the marrow cavity is called the medullary cavity, but most of the time we'll refer to it as the marrow cavity. The ends, both ends of the shaft or the diaphysis are called epiphyses. And they're going to be expanded ends. They're going to be rounded and larger in diameter. And they are covered with articular cartilage, which is formed by hyaline cartilage. And articulations are joints. An articulation is a joint. So articular cartilage is cartilage that covers the ends of bones that come together at a joint. So what we're looking at here is the humerus, which again is the bone of the upper arm or just arm. The shaft of the bone is the diaphysis. And then we have the epiphyses. This one here is the distal epiphysis because it is furthest from the shoulder joint. And then this one is the proximal epiphysis because it is closest. In fact, this end of the humerus partially forms the shoulder joint. Notice that the epiphyses are covered with articular cartilage. They are also formed primarily from spongy bone or cancellous bone that has air spaces. Remember that your red bone marrow is found within the spongy bone. You can also see here the epiphyseal line. Let me see if I can get the highlighter to come up. The epiphyseal line forms in the adult bone when the epiphyseal plate closes. So the epiphyseal plate is cartilage that's there while the bone is still growing. And then once the epiphyseal line forms, there's no more cartilage there. It's closed. And if you find that in a bone, you can tell that this is the bone of an adult. All right, you can see the marrow cavity, which is lined by endosteum. And the outer covering of the bone is called the periosteum. And notice that most of the diaphysis is composed of compact bone, which is a denser bone. Okay, the covering of long bone is called the periosteum, just so you can know that terminology. The two types of bone tissue are compact bone or dense bone. We find that in the walls of the diaphysis of long bones. And then spongy bone, which is also known as cancellous bone, is composed of a network of bony rods separated by air spaces. Where actually it's filled with red bone marrow, so it wouldn't be air spaces. But you find spongy or cancellous bone in the epiphyses and lining the marrow cavity, like a really thin, coming back to this, you see the thin layer of spongy bone that lines the marrow cavity. Even though most of the diaphysis wall is composed of compact bone, it is lined with a very thin layer of spongy bone. Okay, so osteocytes. An osteocyte is a bone cell. It's a mature bone cell. And you can see osteocytes in this microscopic photograph here. They're located here and here and here and here. The osteocytes are surrounded by bone matrix, so they lie within a space or a pocket called a lacuna. And then the layers that you see of bone tissue, like here, and then another layer outside of it, these concentric layers of bone tissue are called lamellae. And then in between the bone cells, in between the osteocytes, you've got to have some kind of way for nutrients and waste to be exchanged, for nutrients and oxygen to get to the bone cells because they're living cells. So the channels that allow for that exchange of nutrients and waste are called canaliculi. And they end up connecting those living bone cells, those osteocytes, to blood vessels. All right, so compact bone tissue is composed of units of bone called osteons. Now, the osteon is going to contain a central canal, and that's where the blood vessels will run within that canal. And then it's going to contain osteocytes within layers of bone called lamellae. And then you will also see perforating canals. Let me see if I can show you. Here's a picture. Okay, so this is compact bone tissue. You can see there is some spongy bone lining the inside of that compact bone. But this tissue that we're looking at mostly is compact bone, and each one of these units, it's like a cylinder. We're looking at the top of it, the top surface of it here, but it runs like a cylinder, kind of like the shape of a, like a straw, okay? So this is an osteon, and you can see in the osteon, let me go back to the arrow. Okay, so you can see in the osteon, you can see the osteocytes that are kind of sandwiched between the layers of bone tissue called lamellae. You can also see very clearly the canaliculi that run between the osteocytes, and then ultimately they end up connecting to the blood vessels here in the central canal. And the perforating canals run perpendicular to the central canal, and they also contain blood vessels. All right, spongy bone does not have osteons. The rods and plates that form spongy bone are called trabeculae. They're still going to have osteocytes within pockets called lacunae. They're still going to have canaliculi because the osteocytes still have to have a way to get nutrients and oxygen. The spongy bone or cancellous bone, remember, contains the red bone marrow that's found within spaces between the rods and the plates called trabeculae. That's listed twice here for some reason. So I just always associate compact bone with units called osteons, and then spongy bone with units called trabeculae. All right, we find spongy bone again, just to review, we find spongy bone in the epiphyses of long bones. The spongy bone is much lighter than compact bone, so it reduces the overall weight of the skeleton, and that makes it easier for us to move, for our muscles to move our skeleton. It would be a lot more difficult if all of our bone tissue was compact bone. We'd be so heavy that moving would be a lot harder. Now, the bone cells are listed on this page, this slide. They're called, the mature bone cells are called osteocytes. That osteo means bone and cyte means cell. So these are the most abundant cells in bone. And they just maintain the bone matrix. Osteoblast and osteoclast are kind of opposites as far as their function. Osteoblast produce new bone matrix, and that process is called ossification. After osteoblasts have surrounded themselves completely by bone matrix, they become osteocytes. Osteoclasts are different. They're very large and they are have many nuclei. They're multinucleate. But what they do is break down bone tissue. Sometimes it's hard to remember, but because if you see just an individual bone, if we were in class and you could see bones in the lab, human bones, or if you see a human skeleton, the bone looks like, it just looks like a solid structure that's already formed and it doesn't change, but it actually is constantly being remodeled, kind of like we lose our top layer of skin and replace our skin every 3 weeks or so. Bone remodels also. Bone tissue is always constantly being broken down, and when bone tissue breaks down, the calcium is released and it raises our blood calcium levels. But when our blood calcium levels are too high, then all that excess calcium is used to create new bone tissue. So it's just constantly, osteoblasts are constantly breaking down bone tissue. Osteoclasts are constantly making new bone tissue. So I'm sorry, I said that backwards. I apologize for that. Make sure you know this, that osteoblasts are making new bone tissue. Osteoclasts are constantly breaking down bone. So what happens is osteoclasts secrete acids and enzymes that dissolve the bone matrix, and that releases minerals like calcium and allows those minerals to enter the blood, and that's called resorption. All right, checkpoint questions. How would a bone's strength be affected if the ratio of collagen to calcium increased? So the strength would be less. The collagen gives more flexibility, the calcium gives more strength, so the bone would be not as strong. And question 4, a sample of a long bone shows concentric layers surrounding a central canal. Is it from the shaft or the end of the bone? And it's from the shaft because that's describing compact bone tissue. All right, number 5, mature bone cells are known as osteocytes. Bone building cells are called osteoblasts, and osteoclasts are bone resorbing cells. And number 6, if the activity of osteoclast exceeds that of osteoblast in a bone, how will the mass of the bone be affected? And the mass would decrease because osteoclasts break down bone tissue.